Eddie Green's wife, Beth Green, had arranged an apartment for John Dillinger and his girlfriend, Evelyn Billy Frechette, at 95 South Lexington Avenue in St. Paul, Minnesota, as Mr. and Mrs. Carl Hellman. John Red Hamilton, his sweetheart, Pat Charrington, and her sister, Opal Long, moved in a little later. Lincoln Court Apartments manager Daisy Coffey became suspicious of the Hellmans' odd behavior and alerted local police. Federal agents of the Bureau of Investigation, thinking they might be members of the Barker Karpis gang, headed over, but the manager didn't recognize them from the mugshots. Still, Inspector William Rohr instructed his agents to pay a visit to the couple in apartment number 303. I'm Yvette, this is Defrag History. Thank you for tuning in to episode 8 of the story of John Dillinger, how it started, how it ended, and everything in between. On March 31st, 1934, at 10 after 10 in the morning, Special Agent Rufus Coulter arrived at the Lincoln Court Apartments with Henry Cummings, a detective of the St. Paul Police Department. Special Agent Rosser Knowles, who'd arrived first, had already circled the block to check for the car that apartment manager Coffey said the Hellmans had bought a few days earlier, a Hudson with cream-colored wheels. While staking out the place, Knowles saw a man in a Ford V8 pick up two ladies, but thinking nothing of it, parked his car to keep an eye on the front and side entrances. He didn't know it, but the driver was John Hamilton, picking up Pat Charrington and Opal Long to get supplies. Agent Coulter and Detective Cummings went up the stairs to the third floor and knocked on the door of apartment 303. No answer. They knocked again, and a third time. Finally, the door opened on a chain, and through the narrow crack, the agent and detective saw the eye of a woman. Coulter asked, "Is Carl here?" "Carl who?" A hungover Billy Frechette was not awake enough to remember that John Dillinger's name was now Carl Hellman. Finally, she said, "Oh, no, Carl isn't in. He may be back later this afternoon. Come back then." The officer said, "We will talk to you." "Who are you?" "Police officers." "I'm not dressed. Come back this afternoon?" "We will wait until you dress. I see no reason for us waiting until this afternoon to talk to you." Billy said she'd get dressed, closed the door, slipped the bolt, and charged into the bedroom where John Dillinger was in bed, asleep. "Get up, Johnny, it's the police." Dillinger woke up fast, shot out of bed, threw on clothes, and started tossing the essentials, guns, and money into a suitcase. Billy was freaking out, but Johnny told her to get a grip and start throwing things into the suitcase. She got dressed and started packing. Johnny stood at the door, holding a special model Thompson. Meanwhile, Detective Cummings had checked for escape routes. Apart from the stairs, there were none. After 3 minutes, Agent Coulter felt something was off. They'd never get a warrant, so they couldn't just bust down the door. If he had, he would have been dead anyway. The lawman agreed they needed more help, and after a short discussion, they decided they'd get more feds. So, Agent Coulter jogged down the stairs to the manager's apartment on the first floor to call Inspector Rohr. The inspector also felt something was off and agreed to send agents over. "And Coulter, be careful, man." Outside the Lincoln Court Apartments, Agent Knowles returned from another circle around the block. 20 after 10, he saw a green Ford V8 coupe roll up and park near the rear entrance. The driver, a tall, slender figure wearing a light brown topcoat and matching felt hat, emerged, crossed the street, and entered the back of the building. Homer Van Meter had arrived to show off his fancy new threads to his gang pals. Knowles didn't recognize him and stayed in the car, keeping his eyes peeled for suspicious vehicles. Outside apartment number 303, Detective Cummings saw a tall, sharp-dressed man coming up the back stairs. Van Meter spotted the man at the door of Dillinger's apartment. "Cop alert!" Van slouched a bit and walked on toward the front staircase, ready to make a run for it, but he bumped into Agent Coulter coming up the stairs. "Double cop alert!" Homer smiled and played it cool. He casually asked the man if he was Johnson by any chance. No. Homer kept moving. Coulter took a second and then called after him. "Who are you?" "I'm a salesman. I sell soap." "Where are your samples?" "Down in my car." The agent asked if he had identification. "No, but I have down in my car." The salesman disappeared from view. 10 seconds later, Coulter sensed something was off. The man hadn't even asked why a stranger would want his ID. "Gangster alert!" Coulter went in pursuit. On the ground floor, the agent checked the foyer but saw no one. He swung around and checked a short stairway into the basement. There, at the bottom, stood the soap salesman, legs spread, pointing a .45 at him. "You see this, asshole? You wanted this? Here it is." Coulter, who hadn't drawn his gun, jumped backward and raced out the front door as Van Meter opened fire. The agent yanked at his coat to get his gun and raced to get to the corner of the building to duck for cover. Van Meter gave chase and kept firing. With snow spewing up all around him, Coulter realized he was being shot at. He'd prayed and prayed to make it to the end of the building in one piece. In his car, Agent Knowles saw Agent Coulter come tearing out of the building with the dapper dandy on his heels, firing at him. Sweet Peter on a popsicle stick! Coulter hooked it around the corner of the building in one piece, slid down the slope to a stop, got his gun out, dropped to a knee, and fired a shot just as the felon came around the corner. Dang, those shots were accurate. Van Meter spun around, raced back into the building, ducked out of the back entrance, and disappeared down the alley. The whole thing had taken about 30 seconds. Agent Knowles raced over to help his partner, pointed at the green V8 at the curb and shouted, "That's the car of the guy who shot at you!" Coulter ran over to the Ford and shot the rear tire, but he was shaking so badly that the point-blank shot took 3 tries. Knowles checked if his partner was okay, then sprinted to a corner drugstore to call the St. Paul police. "Send everybody!" Coulter stood by the car. Now what? Then, machine gun fire coming from inside. Detective Cummings was still waiting at the number 303 door while inside John Dillinger, working fast but ultra calm trademark, finished up packing. Now it was time to clear a path for their getaway. Billy cried, "My God, don't shoot. Try and get out without shooting." Yeah. No. Right then, gunshots rang outside. Johnny blasted a few rounds of his modified .45 through the apartment's wooden door, so he's never getting his deposit back. Detective Cummings lurched back just in time, ducked into an alcove, and emptied his pistol from around the corner. Dillinger picked up a standard submachine gun, opened the door on a crack, stuck the Tommy's muzzle out, and fired several bursts down the hallway. Some of the shots ripped into the next-door apartment, almost hitting the tenants, a minister and his wife. Cummings made for the stairwell, dodging another burst fired in his direction, and slipped halfway down the steps to reload. Billy screamed at the noise, "For God's sakes, don't shoot, I'll stare, I don't care, you go ahead, but don't shoot." Dillinger said, "Come on, baby, it'll be okay, just stay behind me. You're coming with me. Snap that suitcase together and follow along, we're going out." Johnny picked up another machine gun and peered into the hallway. All clear. Let's go. Billy lugged the heavy suitcase with 2 hands down the corridor, while her boo fired a warning volley into every hallway as he backed his way to the rear stairwell. Cummings, hunched in the front stairwell, counted 9.45 slugs whistling overhead. He kept his head down and blindly returned fire, emptying his pistol. Downstairs, Johnny shouted to Billy, "Get the car! The keys are in my coat pocket!" The Hudson was in a rented garage 200 feet away. Meanwhile, Van Meter had run around the building, but saw 2 agents guarding his car. He swung around to find a ride out of there. Just his luck, a slow-moving city sanitation truck. Van jumped on the garbage truck's running board, yanked the passenger door open, and shoved his gun into garbage man Bernard Kirsten's side. He hopped in and ordered the driver, Kirsten's brother, to keep driving west on Lincoln. Van took off his fancy new hat, grabbed Bernard's grubby work cap, and put it on. Meanwhile, in the apartment, eyewitnesses, many of them kids, hung out the windows to witness the scene in the alley below. They saw a lady desperately struggling with a heavy suitcase fall, and a man calmly following her, holding 2 machine guns, occasionally glancing back over his shoulder. There was a red stain just above the man's knee, running down the pant leg and leaving a crimson trail in the snow. John Dillinger had been hit. While Johnny patiently waited in the alley, Billy chucked the suitcases into the Hudson and backed out facing South Lexington Avenue, but Johnny told her, "Pull back in, head out the other way." "Seriously?" Billy backed up and busted the fender on her way back out. Dillinger slipped into the back seat and left blood-stained snow where he had stood. "You drive, I've been hit." Billy saw his gray pants soaked in blood and started to scream. Johnny said, "It's nothing. Drive to Eddie Green's, I'll tell you how to go." The Hudson slipped and slid in the snow, and Billy busted another fender when she glanced off the garage wall, then headed west. Meanwhile, in the garbage truck, Van Meter confessed to the brothers that he'd been ambushed by cops, but didn't mention why. After a few miles, he told the driver to pull over. He peeled off $10 from a roll for their troubles, but they declined. On his way out, he grabbed his fedora and disappeared into a residential neighborhood. John Hamilton, Pat Sherrington, and Opal Long returned from the grocery store to find the Lincoln Court apartment complex swarming with cops. Hamilton parked a block away and sent the girls, holding bags of groceries, to investigate. So, there'd been a gun battle. So, we're gone. The trio couldn't find anyone at the hideouts and ended up in the restaurant of gangster-friendly owner Harry Sawyer, who got them a ride to a hideout out of town. In Minneapolis, Homer Van Meter burst into Eddie Green's apartment. While in the middle of telling the tale of his daring garbage truck escape, there was a knock on the door. It was Billy. "Johnny wants you down in the car, Eddie. He's hurt." Green raced downstairs to find a wounded John Dillinger hemorrhaging all over the Hudson's back seat. Johnny said, "The police raided us. Have you got a place where we can hole in? I caught a slug in the leg." Green insisted they get him a doctor first and drove to the offices of 46-year-old general practitioner Dr. Clayton May. May had practiced medicine in Minneapolis for years, but was known to the government as an abortionist, dope peddler, and associate of hoodlums. May followed Green to an alley to help Mr. D, who had been injured in the explosion of an illegal still. The physician examined the wound. Johnny had been hit by his own ricocheted bullet, a clean through and through. The doctor brought Mr. D to Mrs. Augusta Salt's place to treat the injury. Salt, a nurse with many aliases, ran a sort of private nursing home in Minneapolis that sheltered women seeking illegal abortions. Billy and the doc half-carried John up to the first-floor apartment, where May quickly treated the wound and gave patient D a tetanus shot. The man would be fine, but he was on bed rest for a few days. He could stay at Nurse Salt's place. May would check in with him later. Eddie slipped the doc $1,000. Oh, by the way, his patient was John Dillinger. At 2 p.m., Tommy Carroll parked his 1934 Hudson 8 Club sedan a few doors from the Lincoln Court apartments. On his way in to hang out with John Dillinger and friends, he passed some guys in business suits and a group of curious teens. He took a few more steps before it clicked. Trouble. He casually mixed in with the youth to get the 411. "How do you do, fellow kids?" There was a shootout. Gee, golly. Good times. Laters. Carroll hauled ass back to his car and headed for Eddie Green's place in Minneapolis. The lawmen had been too up to their eyeballs in sifting through the loot in the apartment to even notice him. The men found weapons and ammo, silencers, 2 bulletproof vests, but also some female intimate products, and extensive and expensive wardrobes. They also found 3 photos. One of a small boy perched on a branch. On the back, written in pencil, "John in Cherry Tree, returned to Audrey Hancock." A picture of a toddler. On the back, "John at the age of 3.5 years, returned to Audrey Hancock." The third was a formal portrait of a sailor in his Navy uniform. Hot dang, the shooter had been John Dillinger? Oh man, we're never gonna hear the end of this. They found a getaway map for a bank job in Newton, Iowa. And they found a slip of paper with a phone number. Eddie Green's number. But the feds didn't know what it was and didn't follow up on it right away. Yeah, they're not gonna hear the end of that either. Outside, Special Agent Rufus Coulter placed dibs on the green Ford for the federal motor pool. The car came with a Thompson in an expensive leather case, a .351 Winchester self-loading rifle, and plenty of ammo. Dr. May visited patient D at Nurse Salt's place in the evening. Billy sewed up the bullet holes in her boyfriend's pants and coat, then headed over to Eddie Green's place to sleep. The place was getting a little crowded. So, when Ed's wife, Beth Green, or Bessie as she was more commonly known, came home, she blew a gasket at Van. "Are you crazy? Next to Dillinger, you're the most wanted man in the whole damn world, and here you are under my roof? Why don't you and Carol just leave a sign on your car that says where you are? You're gonna get us all killed. Don't you ever come here again, ever." Van Meter and Carol hustled out and checked into a hotel at New Ulm. 2 days later, Carroll had his Hudson serviced in nearby Mankato, and Van Meter bought a new Ford V8 to replace his lost V8. However, the feds were tipped that gangsters were in town, rushed to Mankato, and impounded Carroll's freshly tuned Hudson at the shop. When the gangsters found out, they took off in Van Meter's new car and went to St. Paul. On the day of John Dillinger's dramatic apartment escape, the St. Paul grand jury investigation into alleged inefficiency and corruption of the police department announced its findings. The investigation had to prove or disprove Attorney General Homer Cummings' claim that St. Paul was a poison pot of crime. The report of the grand jury began, "We believe there is no justification for any charges that an excess of crime exists here. Charges of official incompetence and neglect, these charges have not been sustained by evidence." During the reading, reporters passed around the news of a shooting at the Lincoln Court Apartments. How do you like them apples? And so, that afternoon, the Daily News headline read, "Machine guns blaze as jury whitewashes police." When news spread that the G-men had been in charge of the bungled raid, the public began to doubt the special agent's specialness and adored John Dillinger even more. In Washington, D.C., J. Edgar Hoover fumed that his bureau had been so humiliated. How was he supposed to get funds for his elite force if they blundered like this? He scolded Inspector Rohrer, who'd been responsible for capturing Machine Gun Kelly and his wife Catherine. Why hadn't his office been alerted before the raid? Why were there only 2 agents sent to the scene? Why had they only brought handguns? And why, oh why, did they involve the uber-corrupt local police? Were his men too scared to knock on someone's door without uniformed cops present? And when the lifted fingerprints gathered by the local cops went missing for a bit, Hoover went ballistic. Rohrer protested that he had no fingerprint technicians, but Hoover raged that every agent had been trained to lift fingerprints. If they couldn't, everyone had to go back to school. He told his agents to never ever allow local police to get involved in any raids ever again, unless they were short of equipment like machine guns or gas guns. J.E. sent an army of 15 special agents commanded by 2 assistant directors, Harold Potts Nathan and Hugh Clegg, to the Twin Cities to take charge of the mess. They had to get Dillinger, his #1 priority. Plus, they had to bring down the Floyds, Barrows, and Barkers of the world. But hey, no pressure. The war on crime was now on. For realsies. But Congress still wasn't buying it, and still wouldn't pass President Roosevelt's comprehensive crime package plans. Hoover really needed a win. The G-men went apartment hunting, while Dillinger hideout hunting. They caught their first break when Mrs. Coffey's husband found the address of the dandy shooter. Within an hour, agents had his apartment building at 2214 Marshall Avenue surrounded. The manager recognized Homer Van Meter as the occupant of apartment number 106, which had been rented 2 weeks prior by another man, D. Stevens, even though he hadn't seen either of them for days. Assuming the apartment was now abandoned, the agents had the manager let them in. They had stumbled upon the gang's gun depot. On March 14th, the feds in Washington finally analyzed 17 latent fingerprints taken from Vern Miller's home after the Kansas City massacre. One of the prints belonged to Adam Rachetti, Charles Arthur Pretty Boy Floyd's sidekick. As far as the feds were concerned, this evidence linked Floyd directly to the massacre, so they became federal fugitives. However, local and state police hadn't seen Floyd for over 6 months, and the Oklahoma field office was way too bogged down with 31 separate major cases, including the Barker Karpis Gang and Barrow Gang hunts. Meanwhile, special agent in charge of the Chicago field office, Melvin Purvis, turned up the heat on the Barker Karpis Gang. Many had scattered, but some were still lingering in Chicago, trying to get the ransom money from the Ham and Bremer kidnappings cleaned up. They adopted various disguises, but all the hair dye, mustaches, and dark glasses weren't enough for Alvin Karpis and Fred Barker. They wanted a new face. For a proper fee, Dr. Joseph Moran in Chicago would alter the men's fingerprints and change their faces. But all he ended up doing was butcher his patients, and Kate Ma Barker had to nurse the tortured men back to health. Karpis was stoical, but Freddie often screamed from the pain and had to be restrained. Meanwhile, the feds declared the Barker Karpis Gang the primary suspects in the Bremer kidnapping case, and when the men realized that Frank Nitti of the Chicago outfit might also want them dead, they left Chicago and Ma behind. Unlike the revolving door that was the Dillinger Gang, the Hillbilly Barker Karpus Gang was an airtight, closed unit, entirely unknowable, and the feds got nowhere in tracking them down. Meanwhile, the Texas trio Clyde Barrow, Bonnie Parker, and Henry Methvin had been living out of their fort for months, roaming from state to state. The day after John Dillinger's flight from his St. Paul apartment, they were parked on an unpaved road north of Dallas, Texas, when two highway patrolmen rolled up to have a little chat with what appeared to be vagrants. After some miscommunication between Clyde and Henry, the duo shot and killed the cops and drove off. The day after this shooting, former Texas Rangers Frank Hamer and Manny Gold arrived in Dallas. Lee Simmons, head of the Texas prison system, tasked Hamer to hunt down the Barrow Gang as an officer of the Texas Highway Patrol and special investigator of the prison system. The pay was half of what Hamer currently made as a detective, but he was promised his fair share of the reward money, plus whatever possessions the Barrows had with them when he caught them. Simmons gave no directions other than to put him on the spot, know you're right, and shoot everybody in sight. During another shootout in Oklahoma, Clyde killed a policeman, and the Barrows took injured Chief Percy Boyd along for a ride. They let him out near Fort Scott, Kansas, and Clyde gave him $10 for a bus. Bonnie, annoyed by Southwestern newspapers always printing the picture of her with a cigar, told him, "Tell the public I don't smoke cigars, it's the bunk." That same day, Clyde Barrow was named Texas Public Enemy number 1. Nurse Salt, who had apparently never seen a newspaper in her life, had no idea who her guest was. However, her 13-year-old son Wallace knew exactly who was camped out at their place and eagerly ran errands for the outlaw. This was so cool! The kid scored massive brownie points with John Dillinger when he thought to padlock the garage that hid the gangster's Hudson. At last, Nurse Salt asked Dr. May if the rumors were true. This man was John Dillinger. Really? May was shocked she even had to ask. By April 3, 1934, Dillinger was up and walking, and Dr. May ruled his patient no longer in need of medical care. That same day, federal agents turned Eddie Green's Marshall Avenue apartment inside out. They found 3 notebooks listing getaway routes from banks, assorted ammunition, some dynamite, a fuse, and a stock of his submachine gun. At 11:30 a.m., they heard the front door rattle and hid. They ambushed the woman who entered, Luciana Jackson. She and her sister, Leonia Goodman, waiting in the alley, had been hired by Mr. and Mrs. Stevens to clean the place for $10. The ladies, a notorious gang cleaning crew, had instructions to pack up all the clothing and take it home, where Mr. Stevens would come to pick it up. The agents told her to finish the job, go home, and wait for Mr. Stevens to come. Inspector Rohr gave Special Agent William Notestein an unusual order. If Stevens appeared, they had to shoot him. 3 agents took up positions in the house. A few hours later, when Notestein called for backup, he asked Rohr to restate his orders. If she says that's the man, kill him. On April 3, 1934, at 5:45 p.m., a Terraplane sedan stopped across the street from Leonia Goodman's house, and Eddie Green jumped out. His wife Bessie stayed in the car. He knocked on the kitchen door, and a nervous Leonia shoved the luggage out, then slammed the door shut. Just as Eddie turned to get back to the car, he heard someone say, "Is that the man?" "Yes, that's the man who came by this morning, and that's the man from the apartment." Notestein shouted to Agent George Gross in the living room, "Let him have it!" Gross shot the gangster with his Thompson from the open living room window in the shoulder and in the back of his head. Green collapsed next to the sidewalk. Agents appeared from everywhere and shot at the car to disable the Terraplane's tires. A freak Bessie jumped from the car and shouted, "Please don't shoot anymore, we're all alone!" Everyone halted fire. Bessie ran toward her bleeding husband and cradled his head, trying to bandage it. Notestein was shocked to see a sobbing woman leaning over the fallen man's body. He asked Mrs. Goodman whether she was positive it was the right man. Mrs. Goodman hysterically cried it was. The G-men had no chill, yanked Bessie away, and placed her under arrest for harboring a fugitive. Well, the man on the sidewalk wasn't John Dillinger, but good enough. Eddie was taken to Minneapolis's Anchor Hospital, where he remained in critical condition. The bullet had gone around inside the skull and was stuck in his head. The doctors thought he was done for, but Green hung on, drifting in and out of consciousness and hallucinating. The next day, around 11 a.m., Eddie mistook a nurse for Bessie and told her to clear out their apartment and take everything to John. A federal agent listening in tricked Eddie into revealing John's address: 635 Park Avenue. Woo! Rock and roll! Federal agents headed out. So 635 Park Avenue didn't exist. While out there, the G-men received another message. Green had mumbled another address: 1835 Park Avenue, Apartment 4. The following afternoon, April 5th, the Bureau's Assistant Director Hugh Clegg, who had just arrived in St. Paul, rounded up the troops, headed over, and covered every exit of the building. Clegg crept to the door with 3 agents all armed with submachine guns. He said, "We knocked on the door, and a man of about 45 to 50 years of age came to the door. Upon opening the door, machine guns were punched right in his stomach, and he was ordered to stick 'em up. He did not stick 'em up, but seemed to be amused. His wife, a small woman, was quite excited and wanted to shoot the agents. No shooting was done. There was a little girl in the place. It was the wrong apartment. It took the agents days to figure out that Dillinger's hideout was downstairs. It didn't matter. One John already gone. He'd moved out hours before Eddie Green tattled on him. With John gone, Dr. May decided to hide and told Mrs. Salt to flee with him. Now Johnny was on the run again, but where could he go? All roads were blocked, and federal, state, and local authorities had launched what reporters called the greatest manhunt in U.S. history. Well, John Dillinger decided to go to the last place in the world he figured anyone would think to look for him. He went home, to his father's farm in Mooresville, Indiana. He was not wrong. No one was looking for him there. Not even the G-men. Yet. Shortly after dusk on April 4th, 1934, John Dillinger and his girl Billie Frechette fled Minneapolis and headed for Mooresville, Indiana. Since Dillinger's limp could attract attention to his face, they only traveled at night using roundabout routes. John had dreaded seeing his father again, but ever since Junior had seen the newsreel of Senior bragging about his son's escape from Crown Point, he figured it'd be all right. 2 days later, on April 6th, John concealed his car on the parallel dirt road a quarter mile behind his father's farm and guided Billy along the familiar gullies toward the house. Dillinger Sr. had often laid awake at night, worried sick about his boy. He was in bed when he heard a knock on the door. It was Billy. Sr. recalled. She whispered, "Johnny is out by the barn. Is it all right?" "Yes, it's all right," I told her. A moment later, Johnny entered the kitchen. He looked at me a long time. Then he laughed out loud. He put a machine gun down on the table and shook my hand. He introduced me to the girl and said they were married, but his eyes laughed when he said it, and so did hers. I told John it wasn't safe for them here. "Probably not, Dad, but I just wanted to see you before anything happens." We talked all night. Before dawn, John got the Hudson and stashed it in the barn, and Doris, 15, and Francis, 11, rushed downstairs to embrace their big brother. A few hours later, Dillinger's 21-year-old half-brother Hubert unexpectedly arrived. John popped around the corner, made a gun with his thumb and finger, and said, "Stick 'em up." After a cheerful reunion, the brothers went to the barn, took off the Hudson's cream-colored tires, and painted them black. As Dillinger also painted the trim black, he asked, "Want to take a ride with me to Ohio, bud?" Hubert jumped at the opportunity. John and Hubert Dillinger left at 8 p.m. for the Pierpont farm in Lipsick, Ohio, to give Harry Pierpont's parents money for lawyers' fees. Near Indianapolis, Hubert saw a police car and got nervous, but Johnny, knowing the Hudson's power and with a submachine gun in reach, assured his brother, "Don't pay any attention to them. We can run off and leave them anytime." However, the Pierpont farm was deserted. The family had moved to Goshen, Indiana to get away from police harassment. John had Hubert drive back to Mooresville so he could sleep. But Hubert had trouble keeping his eyes open, and at 4 a.m. smashed the big Hudson into the rear of a slow-moving Model T Ford just over the Hamilton County border, shearing off its left rear wheel. The Hudson lost a front wheel, careened across the northbound lane, went over a ditch, mowed down a fence, and plowed 300 feet through a field of tree stumps, missing them all. That woke Hubert and Johnny up fast. They were fine. They ran over to check on Mr. and Mrs. Manning in the other car. Also fine. The outlaw apologized and promised to pay for the damage. As the Mannings left to get help, they saw their kind man pulling off the car's number plates and grabbing a machine gun from the back seat. Okay. Johnny and Hubert got to a farm 3 miles down the road. Then dawn broke. John hid in a haystack and Hubert hitched a ride with a passing truck. He returned to his father's farm, jumped in his Chevy, and drove back to get his brother. Junior had tied a handkerchief around a post, and when Hubert pulled over, Johnny emerged and got in. Hamilton County Sheriff Frank Hattery inspected the crash scene, and something didn't add up. The new Hudson nearly had 1,400 miles on the odometer, the wheels and trim were recently painted over, it had no license plates, and, well, there was a full machine gun magazine in the back. He called Indiana State Police Captain Matt Leach, who had just welcomed 2 federal agents in his office. They all drove to Noblesville to check the wreck. Leach found no blood, but some rope and a bullwhip. Weird flex, but okay. They were not for robberies, but for John Dillinger's Jesse James cosplay. Leach traced a car to a dealer in St. Paul who said he'd sold it to Carl Hellman a couple of weeks ago. Matt fell to his knees, raised his fist dramatically to the sky, and yelled, "Dillinger!" Okay, he didn't, probably, but Leach told reporters, "Just look at that. There's some more Dillinger luck. It had miraculously missed a dozen trees. Nobody could have been so fortunate but Dillinger." The captain ordered roadblocks all across central Indiana. The federal agents were stunned. But John Dillinger was in Minnesota, wasn't he? Maybe we should, stake out old man Dillinger's farm or something? Well, then they needed more men. J. Edgar Hoover was like, say no more. He sent over 10 agents to G-Man Earl Connolly's improvised headquarters at the Spink Arms Hotel in Indianapolis. That afternoon, the feds knew the addresses of John Dillinger Sr., Audrey Hancock, and Hubert's Indianapolis filling station. They didn't have enough agents to stake them all out, so the G-Men would drive loops to keep an eye on all. In Mooresville, John Jr. ragged on Hubert's seriously lacking driving skills. Around 10 a.m. he gave his brother money and sent him and Billy to Indianapolis to buy a new set of wheels, a 1933 Essex Terraplane if possible. At a time when most people couldn't even afford a bicycle, America's most wanted bought and dumped high-end luxury vehicles like disposable razor blades. Well, at least job creator Dillinger did his part to refuel the Depression-era economy. The dealership had no 1933 Terraplanes, and the salesman talked Billy into buying a green Ford V8. Billy wanted it painted black. She could pick it up that afternoon. Meanwhile, Dillinger chilled on the living room couch to rest his wounded leg, keeping a submachine gun under his blanket. He cracked up, reading the papers his father had saved. He wasn't laughing at the funny pages, but at the crazy articles written about him. A little later, Emmett Hancock, husband of Johnny's sister Audrey, swung by the farm. As he stood talking to Senior on the porch, Johnny stuck his head out the kitchen window and yelled, "What the hell? Come in here. You can talk to Dad anytime." Emmett rushed in to greet his brother-in-law and then raced out to pick up Audrey in Maywood. Just as Billy pulled up to the house in the new car, Big Sis Audrey arrived with her 14-year-old daughter Alberta. Dillinger walked outside when they came up the driveway, greeting all the women with a kiss. According to John Sr., Audrey rushed to his side, broke down and cried. Johnny kissed her, and big tears came into his eyes too. He had an awfully loving nature that way. When Audrey realized her brother had been shot, she treated the wound with peroxide and bandaged him up again. A little later, Audrey's 2 sons, Norman and Fred Hancock, drove up as well. Then Johnny's favorite niece, 18-year-old Mary Hancock, showed up. Mary, an aspiring beauty school grad, gave her uncle that manicure she had promised him in her letters. As she was filing away, Mary bumped his leg and Johnny winced. She apologized profusely, but her uncle said with a smile, "Forget it, kid, it was nothing." At one point, Audrey's husband Emmett took Dillinger aside and asked him what had happened at Crown Point. John said, "Big boy, let me tell you something. If you don't know anything, you can't tell anything, can you? No? Let that be a lesson to you." They all agreed to have a big Sunday dinner after church the following day. Audrey and Emmett went home to prepare it, while Fred drove the new Ford to a hiding place in town. After dinner, Senior and Junior took a walk across the fields into the woods. Johnny assured his father that he was not as bad a man as the newspapers made him out to be. "Still, there is no road back, Dad. I couldn't go back if I wanted to." He couldn't surrender. Officials would stop at nothing to get him into the electric chair. Johnny concluded, "I've set my course and I'll have to follow it to the end. I will never go back to prison alive." When they got to the woods on the hill, Senior stopped. I said, "John, if anything happens to you, what do you want me to do? I've got room for you at Crown Hill right next to your mother." He looked at me. He was older, quieter. "That'll be all right, Dad." We gripped each other's hands standing there in the woods and stood for a moment, silent and reverent. To me, it will be always one of the most sacred moments of my life. Sunday, April 8, 1934, was a gorgeous spring day. After church, 13 members of the Dillinger clan sat down for dinner. Emmett and Audrey, their 4 children, Hubert and his wife, Dillinger Sr., his 2 young daughters, Doris and Frances, and of course Billy and Johnny. Old John recalled, "What a feast they set out. There were fried chicken, mashed potatoes that were almost like whipped cream, luscious gravy, peas, lettuce, celery, hot biscuits, honey, jellies, and to top it all off, the best coconut cream pies that Audrey ever made." Audrey's coconut cream pie was Johnny's favorite, and what he had really come home for, he told her. She had baked 3 and offered to make some more for him to take with him when he left. But Johnny took her in his arms, patted her head, and told her that she'd already done enough. The dinner was joyful, but laced with fear. I noticed with the start that there were 13 of us around the table. Wasn't there a saying that 13 at a table meant that one was soon to die? The Dillingers did their best to shake off the feeling of dread and make the occasion what John Sr. called a joyous family event that will stand forth in our memories all of our lives. At any moment, the doors might be flung open and men with blazing guns invade our midst. Our feast might be turned into a tragedy in the twinkling of an eye. Johnny especially refused to give in to fear. Senior recalled, he was, for the hour at least, once more the happy-go-lucky, carefree boy whom we remembered from other days. Johnny cracked jokes and the whole table laughed. But his father observed, "I said we laughed, yet there wasn't one of us who was not ready to cry the next moment." Afterward, everyone went for a walk toward the woods. Dillinger held hands with his niece Mary. He was moved to clean up his reputation. "No matter what you heard about the things I've done, I want you to know that I've never killed anyone and I never will. You believe what's in the papers if you want to. Take about half with a grain of salt. Believe half of what is left and you've got it made." They returned to the house and posed for snapshots. The most infamous being the one where John Dillinger Jr. is smiling, holding his machine gun in one hand and his wooden pistol in the other. But the family asked a friend to process the film, fearing a commercial lab could rat them all out. It was all fun and laughter, until a plane circled overhead and flew low over the house, nearly hitting the chimney. They could see one of the passengers holding binoculars. The G-men later determined it was a stunt flyer. Johnny ducked into the barn. It was the first time the others saw him worried. Hubert and Fred Hancock took the children outside to fly a kite. By now, many Mooresvillians knew John Dillinger was at his father's farm, and many drove their cars up and down Route 267 to catch a glimpse of the infamous Dillinger homestead. Among the caravan of cars were 2 young federal agents who had just flown into Indiana, J. Algarity and T.J. Donegan. They couldn't get an eye line on the farmhouse, couldn't find a place to park and watch the house, and could only catch a glimpse of the driveway by driving up and down the road. In the driveway, they saw 2 sedans and a Chevy Coupe, Hubert's car, the man they'd been ordered to watch. Eagle-eyed niece Mary told her mother, "There's a car out there with a couple of fellas and it looks suspicious." Audrey told her brother. "I don't like the look of that car, John. You and your girl had best leave while there's still time." Johnny preferred a nighttime departure, but it was getting too darn hot. He sent Hubert and Fred to retrieve his new Ford. And so, when the G-men passed the house again, they noticed Hubert's Chevy was gone and raced off to find it. They saw it driving back to the farm, a brand new black Ford in tow. They figured the Ford was unrelated and ignored it. They stopped for a moment so they wouldn't raise suspicions. Too late. Hubert warned Dillinger that he had seen what he believed to be federal agents. Hubert and Fred left again in the Chevy, and when Donegan and Garrity passed the farm again, they saw no Chevy and chased after it again. They gave up at Plainfield and headed back to the farm. They noticed the shiny new black Ford from earlier pulled over by the side of the road with 3 women inside, just as a man got out. Both agents got a good look at him. They guessed he was about 35, under 6 feet tall, well-built, and wearing a gray summer suit and a matching hat. They didn't recognize him. Later, they swore to their superiors it couldn't have been John Dillinger. Well, it was. Dillinger had organized a 3-car getaway plan with Audrey, John Sr., and Billy all driving off in different directions at once. Billy's female-filled Ford had Mary beside her and Alberta sitting in the back. Dillinger, covered with a blanket, lay on the back floorboard, clutching his machine gun. Around Plainfield, Dillinger thought they were safe and told Billy to pull over so he could get up. Just then, the feds drove by. Dillinger turned and watched over his left shoulder as the agents continued on to check on the farm. Again, the Bureau never said a word about this incident. Smart move. They'd let John Dillinger slip away again. When Harry Pierpont's parents, Gilbert and Lena Pierpont, heard that John Dillinger was looking for them, they arranged a meeting in Mars Hill, Indianapolis. Dillinger got into the Pierpont's Auburn and held a strategy session with Lena and Mary Kinder, while Gilbert aimlessly drove around. Billy followed them in the Ford with Audrey's son, Norman. A frazzled Lena was fighting for a stay of execution for her son and asked Johnny for money to finance the appeals. Dillinger promised he'd dedicate his next bank job to get it. John slipped Mary $1,000 for Harry's lawyer, Jesse Levi, but Mr. Pierpont objected. That woman had lost the case, but Dillinger argued that only Miss Levi could get a new trial. And just like that, Johnny and Billy were gone. Mary Kinder returned to her new home on Louette Street and, with her coat still on, sank into a chair. A moment later, there was a knock at the door. It was a police officer. A cavalcade of police cars jammed the streets. G-men, 4 Indianapolis detectives, and 10 heavily armed police officers raided Mary Kinder's home and executed Hoover's new directive, Operation Make Families Suffer. J.E. wanted to make life miserable for anybody, friend or family, who offered John Dillinger the slightest relief. Once they were driven mad, they'd be begging for peace and turn him in. They found Mary's mother, Shirley Patterson, and a family friend named Claude Parker. When the lawmen came across a locked bathroom, one of the agents knocked and said he wanted to come in to see if Dillinger was there. Mary's sister, silent Margaret Behrens, was taking a bath and shouted, "Well, if you want to wash my back, come on in." The whole thing was a bust. Again. John Dillinger was en route to Chicago, traveling along the back roads he knew so well. At 3 p.m., he met with his lawyer, Louis Pickett's investigator, Arthur O'Leary, to discuss a few matters. Following the Barker Karpus gang's idea, he asked if Pickett knew a plastic surgeon to work on his now very recognizable face. "I want to live like other people. Billy and I would like to be married and settle down somewhere." O'Leary promised he'd ask. Billy Frechette contacted one of Opal Long's old boyfriends, Larry Strong, who could arrange a new hideout. They would meet at 8 p.m. at his tavern called the Tumble Inn. Following Director Hoover's criticism, Special Agent in charge Melvin Purvis had worked hard to build a network of informants. He got a call, probably from his recent convert Larry Strong, about the meeting. Purvis put on a shabby outfit and led his team of 12 agents to the Tumble Inn. The chief entered the inn, while his agents mixed in with the crowd outside, awaiting his signal to enter and arrest the outlaw. Purvis didn't see Dillinger, only an elderly man, a boy, and Larry Strong drunk at the bar talking to the bartender. Strong didn't recognize Purvis. At about 8:30 p.m., the gangster and his moles circled the block to scan for agents, but Purvis's men were well hidden. Dillinger thought it was safe and parked on the street corner across from the bar. Frechette told him she'd go in first. "The last time you went in somewhere, you were arrested." She kissed John goodbye, entered the tavern, and walked up to Strong at the bar. Agent Purvis casually offered her a stool, but she shook her head, ordered a beer, and leaned toward Strong to talk. Purvis couldn't overhear the whispered conversation, and a few minutes later he got up, walked outside, and signaled his agents. He would execute Hoover's new moles and all policy. Billy was just about to walk out and signal Dillinger that it was safe when 5 or 6 G-men surrounded her with pistols and machine guns. Purvis arrested Strong and took 2 men to search the tavern's basement. For some reason, no Dillinger. In his Ford, Johnny watched in horror as the men handcuffed Billy. He grabbed his Thompson, eased away, circled the block, and looked for a shot. But when more feds flooded in, he gave up. As Billy was shoved into a federal car, he drove off, while he, as he said in his own words, cried like a baby. Purvis emerged from the basement search and realized he should have asked how Billy had arrived. She shrewdly said she'd arrived by taxi, but someone else said, in a car. Several agents raced outside. One John, already gone. 3 different agents had passed a parked car. One didn't think Dillinger was the driver. One had written down the license plate number, but didn't believe Dillinger was inside. And one had seen Frechette get out of the car, but didn't want to risk stooping low enough to check if the outlaw was behind the wheel. Hoover was so pleased with the Frechette catch that he didn't mind Dillinger got away. Too much. The feds didn't clue in the press about the arrest, but a top gangster's mole's capture was just enough to prove to the public that the Bureau was making progress. John headed for the Crystal Ballroom at Fox River Grove, a popular gangster-friendly resort and dance hall owned by Louis Cernucci. The innkeeper's kind-hearted wife Mary led the teary-eyed Johnny to the kitchen and fried him a steak to try to cheer him up. Dillinger dried his tears and called O'Leary to ask Pickett, who was out of town, to get a writ to get Billy out. Art would get right on it. Johnny vowed to avenge Billy's arrest. He'd break her out and punish the men who put her there. At the top of his goon list, marked for death, was Melvin Purvis. Federal agents brought Billy Frechette to the Chicago field office on the 19th floor of the Bankers Building and put her in the conference room. Frechette remained handcuffed and was questioned throughout the night. She never said a word about Johnny. "They kept me up, talking to me until I didn't know what I was saying. Then they'd leave me alone for a long time. I was nearly crazy. They thought John was coming to rescue me." She begged them to let her sleep, but the agents refused. When Melvin Purvis's secretary Doris Rogers came in to bring her a sandwich, she was horrified. Rogers told Melvin, "This is inhumane." Purvis gave her permission to take her to the ladies' room so she could sleep on the couch. Doris gave Billy a glass of water and told her to lie down. However, after an hour, Rogers had to wake her up again. Frechette begged Doris not to bring her back to the conference room and promised to tell Rogers everything, but Rogers had no choice. G-men Harold Reinecke and Murray Faulkner had arrived to take over the interrogation, and things got really rough. They reportedly slapped her and deliberately put her under bright lights to disorient her. With the feds being ridiculed in the papers, they were desperate for something, anything. But Billy misled them constantly and sent them on wild raids that yielded nothing. She then laughed in their faces. Maybe they were just too stupid and too clumsy to sneak up on Dillinger. On April 11th, lawyer Louis Pickett arrived to discover that the feds were playing fast and loose with Billy's civil rights, but he was stonewalled at every turn. She had a state-appointed attorney, Jerome Hoffman, and the G-men wouldn't let him speak to Frechette and refused to tell him where she was or when she'd be charged and arraigned. On Wednesday night, the agents finally allowed Billy to sleep on office chairs, but they woke her up again a few hours later and hustled her to the Lansing apartments, where 3 federal agents guarded her until her arraignment. Meanwhile, the Nelson-Dillinger gang remained dormant. John Dillinger hid out in Fort Wayne, Indiana with Homer Van Meter. Johnny, devastated by Billy Frechette's arrest, searched for ways to rescue her. She was too heavily guarded, but he had read in the papers that she would soon be transferred to St. Paul. He would rescue her en route. There'd be a firefight, probably a bloodbath, but it would be worth it. However, to pull it off, he needed to replace the bulletproof vest left behind in the St. Paul apartment. Van knew where to get some. Eddie Green, half comatose in his hospital bed, wasn't safe from incessant questioning either. Agents posing as doctors and nurses posing as his wife Bessie tried to get him to reveal all about John Dillinger and fellow gangsters. All they got was outdated information, useful for profiling but little else. Then, on April 10th, 7 days after he was shot, Eddie Green's fever spiked to 104.6 and he died. Newspapers stated that the cowardly federal boys had assassinated Eddie since they had shot an unarmed man in the back. Well, the feds claimed that Eddie had made a suspicious move. No, wait, scratch that, it was a menacing move. They said the gangster had reached for a gun that he didn't have. Genius. The backlash at the federal agents' disproportionate use of violence was severe, but St. Paul authorities had to drop the investigation for lack of reliable witnesses to the event. Naturally, politicians seized the opportunity and used Green's public execution as evidence that an unchecked government goon squad was an abomination. Yeah, them President Roosevelt's crime bills weren't going anywhere. A devastated Beth Green decided to save herself and became a federal informant and info dumped on Assistant Director Hugh Clegg. She gave him all the names of the new Dillinger gang: Homer Van Meter, Tommy Carroll, a man called Red, and a vicious little 24-year-old named George Babyface Nelson, whom Green said was just a kid. But wait, there was more. Eddie Green was heavily involved with several other gangs. She handed the feds all the intel about the Barker Karpus gang members and their moles. She outed tavern owner Harry Sawyer as a key player in the criminal underworld and revealed the gangsters' favorite hangout, Louis Cernaki's Crystal Ballroom in Fox River Grove just outside Chicago. However, the Bureau's resources were stretched beyond its limits. They couldn't follow up on all the leads. Hoover now relied entirely on Melvin Purvis to get the job done, and he sent his special agent in charge an encouraging handwritten promise that he never kept. Spoilers. Well, son, keep a stiff upper lip and get Dillinger for me, and the world is yours. On Friday, April 13th at 1:15 a.m., Night Patrolman Judd Pittenger just finished walking his beat around the streets of the business section of Warsaw, Indiana, 30 miles west of Fort Wayne. Nothing ever happened in Warsaw, Indiana. Tonight, he heard footsteps behind him. Then he heard a man say, "We want your bulletproof vests and we mean business." He turned to see John Dillinger pointing a gun at him. During Pittenger's 17 years of service, the 49-year-old patrolman had wrestled plenty with armed criminals and had even gotten shot in the neck once. Pittenger ninja seized the barrel of Dillinger's gun. John warned, "Leave loose, we don't want to kill you." As the two men struggled, Homer Van Meter circled behind Pittenger and rammed his gun into his side. The policeman let go. Van Meter pulled a pistol from the man's holster and whacked him over the head with it for good measure. 4 times. Pittenger yelped, "Don't hit me anymore!" Dillinger told Van Meter to stop. John told the cop they wanted access to the department's weapons closet, but Pittenger said he didn't have the key. "Who has the key?" "I don't know." "Don't be a fool. We don't want to be forced to kill you," Pittenger pleaded. "I don't want you to kill me. I have a couple of kids at home," Dillinger replied. "That's the reason we don't want to kill you." With a sigh, Pittenger reached into his pocket and handed over the key. The duo marched the man through an alley toward the deserted police station on the 2nd floor of the town hall. As Van Meter started cleaning out the weapons closet, Dillinger became enthralled with a bulletin board with 5 newspaper photos of himself. The caption read, "If you see this man, telephone the police at once." Neither was watching Pittenger, who made a run for it and called for help at a nearby restaurant. He told Central, "Dillinger's in town and got 3 of our vests." Meanwhile, the hoodlums didn't bother with the runaway cop, jumped into a big black sedan waiting outside, and fled. All the duo got from the underfunded station was 2 revolvers and 3 done-right bulletproof vests. Within hours, Matt Leach had roadblocks thrown up all over northern Indiana, and by mid-morning, 5,000 vigilantes and Indiana lawmen were out looking for the gangsters. But Van and John already gone. On Friday, April 13th, Mary Evelyn Frechette was arraigned before Commissioner Edwin Walker and charged with conspiracy to harbor a federal fugitive. She had yet to speak to her lawyer, Louis Pickett. Frechette's appointed attorney Hoffman cross-examined Agent Reinecke. He denied slapping her, only that he held her chin up, but Billy gave a devastating description of her brutal interrogation. John Dillinger was convinced Reinecke had mistreated his girl and put his name near the top of his goon death list. Prosecutor Dwight Green believed Billy's famous boyfriend had unlimited funds and demanded bail be set at a whopping $200,000. Pickett protested, and Commissioner Walker set the bond at $60,000, over $1.3 million in today's dollars. Way above Johnny's pay grade. On Saturday, April 14th, John Dillinger went to Louisville, Kentucky to get an x-ray of his aching leg. Dr. David Wilmoth recognized the outlaw, told him the x-ray office was closed, and scheduled the appointment for the following Tuesday, April 17th at 11 a.m. at the Starks building. He then called the police. That night, O'Leary had another meeting with Dillinger in Chicago. O'Leary thought he saw Johnny across the street and tipped his hat. The other man tipped his hat. It was the underworld sign that they weren't being followed. If someone walked with one or both hands on the lapel of the coat or spat, it meant there was a tail. O'Leary crossed the street. "Hello, Art. Get in the car." O'Leary hopped into the front seat and noticed two men in the back. The driver's hat was pulled down to conceal his face. Wait, was this a police trap? "Johnny, is it you?" "Of course it's me." "Take off your hat." "Okay, what's the matter?" "I just wasn't sure, especially with those fellas in the back." Dillinger laughed and introduced Red. O'Leary shook the man's hand. That was missing two fingers. John Hamilton. The other man, a dark, tall individual, wasn't introduced, but Johnny called him Van, Homer Van Meter. Dillinger was disappointed to hear of Billy's arraignment and the impossible bail. Could Art find out how and when she would be moved to St. Paul? He'd liberate her from the whiskers. Van Meter and Hamilton had tried to talk Dillinger out of this stupid plan, but O'Leary promised he'd try to find out. 2 days later, Dillinger left a phone message for O'Leary, which simply said, 4 p.m., 32 West and 16 North. When O'Leary arrived, Pat Sherrington sat in the front with Dillinger, but she climbed into the back to sit next to her boo, John Hamilton, who was happy to see her, but now that was a machine gun in his lap, under a blanket. "Any news about Billy?" Art said he didn't know anything about Billy's pending transport. Dillinger was disappointed. Well, O'Leary didn't know because he'd never asked. He and Pickett agreed they wouldn't help Dillinger pull off a bloody rescue attempt. O'Leary told him to have faith in the court system and Pickett, who'd go to St. Paul to help defend her. Dillinger peeled off $500 for a start. Any news about a plastic surgeon? Lou had found Dr. Ralph Robain, who charged $5,000. Dillinger gasped, "That's a lot of dollars." O'Leary was baffled. "Not when you consider how dangerous it is. Hell, man, don't you realize you're the hottest person in the whole United States?" Dillinger figured, well, as long as he does a good job, it'd be all right. He said he was leaving Chicago, and he'd check in later. The next morning, on April 17th, 4 special agents and 2 Louisville police detectives waited in the Starks building for Dillinger to show up for his x-ray. 22 more tried to blend into the scenery outside, cosplaying clerks, office workers, and citizens. "Stop the presses!" No, I mean, really. A front-page Herald headline read that morning, "U.S. lays Dillinger trap around Starks building." Well, guess who never showed up for his x-ray? On that same day, G-Men called Mrs. Salt and asked for an appointment with Dr. May. When the physician entered the room, one of the agents said, "I suppose you know what we want you for." May said, "Well, I guess they have got us." Dr. May and Nurse Salt were charged with harboring John Dillinger and performing illegal procedures. Meanwhile, the feds, acting on an anonymous tip, went on the hunt for Dr. Ralph Robain, which wasn't his real name. In Indianapolis, Special Agent in Charge Earl Connolly executed Operation Make Families Suffer with cutthroat precision and went after John Dillinger's family members. The G-men, arriving with weapons drawn, picked up Hubert and several cousins for questioning. Hubert counted 14 squad cars in front of his house. Still, Connolly got nothing, though Fred Hancock helpfully hinted the G-men should check Arizona. The feds needed to ditch the bargain basement snitches and get some top-notch stool pigeons. Connolly dredged up snitch Art McGinnis and paid him to hang out at Hubert's filling station. He got nothing. Meanwhile, the Associated Press reported that John Dillinger was seen 200 times in half a dozen states, sometimes in 10 places at once. Lawmen all over the Midwest had to sort through all leads, most of them false, some of them deliberately concocted. A young man confessed he had lied to the police when he reported Dillinger had given him a lift on a highway and dropped him off at a nearby tourist camp. He finally apologized. "I must have been crazy. I just wanted some of the publicity." And a 19-year-old girl confessed to the G-men that she was with Dillinger at the Warsaw raid, but eventually broke down and said she only wanted her name in the papers. The Indianapolis News reported that a French clairvoyant, a professeur de sciences occultes visiting from the University of Paris, claimed that she could see Dillinger hiding in San Francisco and predicted his imminent capture or death. Well, that lead was as good as any. The hunt for John Dillinger became a national obsession. The Universal Newsreel Company offered $5,000 for anyone, cop or civilian, who arranged or alerted them to the capture of Dillinger so they could film it. Indiana police shut down a lottery taking bets on his arrest date. And a street vendor sold envelopes with Dillinger photos for 50 cents, about $10 today. When customers complained the envelopes were empty, the vendor said, "He got away from you too." The feds received countless letters from citizens with helpful suggestions on how to catch the gangster, implying that Hoover and his men sucked at their jobs. However, Special Agent in Charge Melvin Purvis kept his cool. He told the press, "Sometime one of those tips is going to be true, and then we're going to catch Dillinger, and that time is going to be soon. We'll get him." In all fairness, the Bureau had never tracked gangsters like Dillinger. The agents who had only just started carrying guns had gone from tracking benign white-collar crimes to hunting violent criminals and had to invent protocols as they went. And, well, there just weren't that many of them. Melvin Purvis suggested to Hoover to post a $5,000 reward for information leading to Dillinger's capture. Hoover vetoed the idea. He figured that their searches and raids failed because the agents had no system, no plan, no discipline. Things had to be streamlined. On April 18th, Hoover told Purvis to quit chasing down Indiana leads and stay in Chicago. The director then ordered all special agents in charge to check all leads with Purvis and call him at least once a day. That same day, Purvis got a golden tip. John Dillinger and John Hamilton were in Sault Ste. Marie, in Upper Michigan. So he quickly rounded up agents and chartered a plane. John Dillinger was feeling lonely and blue now that his true love was out of reach. John Hamilton wasn't feeling any better. He kept muttering he would die soon. Suddenly, he wanted to visit his sister one last time. Since he would gift her his Ford, Johnny had to come along and give him a ride back. Dillinger was like, "I don't know." But Red told him that he had his chance to say goodbye to his family. He was coming along. So, in the late afternoon on Tuesday, April 17th, John Dillinger strapped on a stolen bulletproof vest, loaded up on guns and ammo, got in his V8, and followed Hamilton and Pat Sherrington in Red's V8 the 450 miles to Sault Ste. Marie, far north in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. At 8:30 p.m., Pat Sherrington went up the steep hill to a small house on 14th Street and knocked on the kitchen door. She confirmed that the lady who opened the door was Mrs. Anna Steve, Hamilton's 39-year-old sister. She said, "Now don't be afraid, don't say a word. I've got a surprise. There's someone here who wants to see you." Hamilton appeared, carrying a machine gun wrapped in a blanket. Dillinger, right behind him, held a rifle. Anna, who hadn't seen her brother in 7 years, began to cry. Red hugged her and warned her they couldn't stay long. Mrs. Steve wanted to go out and buy some steaks to celebrate, but Dillinger told her to cook what she had. So, a cheerful bacon, eggs, and toast dinner at the kitchen table it was. Hamilton was happy for the first time in weeks, but when brother and sister were alone, Red said he didn't think it would be long before they were all dead. After dinner, both men shaved, and Mrs. Steve gave John and Johnny haircuts. But Dillinger couldn't sit still, worried the police could show up any minute. Around 10, the kitchen door swung open. Heart attacks all around. It was Mrs. Steve's 18-year-old son, Charles Campbell. Hamilton introduced the man who needed no introduction. "Charles, this is Johnny." Dillinger remained on edge, sitting silently by the window reading a newspaper and peeking outside. Hamilton then had his nephew get one of his boyhood friends, Paul Parquet. It was an awkward reunion made weirder by the man coming face to face with the country's most wanted man, Dillinger. At 11 p.m., Johnny was like, "We're leaving." Red wanted to stay the night, but John said it wasn't safe. The Whiskers were out there, watching them. Paranoid much? So Hamilton said goodbye to his weeping sister, walked down the hill, and got into Dillinger's V8 with Pat, leaving his V8 behind. However, they missed the ferry across Lake Michigan, and Charrington signed them into a hotel. Dillinger had been right to worry. The following morning, a snitch told Sheriff Willard Welsh that the Steves had entertained John Dillinger, Red Hamilton, and a shapely brunette. Welsh called Special Agent Melvin Purvis, who chartered a plane. But bad headwinds forced them to land in Green Bay, Wisconsin. The weather cleared the following morning, and the G-men arrived safely to deploy Operation Make Families Suffer. They turned the home of Mrs. Steve upside down and combed the surrounding countryside. They found nothing. This was becoming a pattern. Get a tip, do a search, and one John already gone. Okay, 2 Johns already gone. The agents settled for arresting Mrs. Steve and her son Charles for harboring an interstate car thief. Operation Make Families Suffer was a hit. A year later, Anna was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 3 months in jail and fined $1,000. Her son Charles was acquitted. Also, Hamilton's Ford was added to the Bureau's growing fleet. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Louis Pickett had finally been given access to Billie Frechette, and she waived extradition to Minnesota. Pickett, having a bone to pick with the stonewalling federal men, talked to the press. The government tried to keep the story of Billie's arrests under wraps, and only a few papers got wind of it. But now Pickett laid it all out and gave reporters Billie's version of how the tavern raid went down. John Dillinger and I sat in the tavern quite a long time eating and drinking. Suddenly, these agents came bursting in from the front and the rear and all sides, it seemed. They had all kinds of shotguns and rifles. There were more agents than I knew existed. John saw the agents come in. He got up and walked up to the front and sort of mingled with the people and the agents. Then he walked outside and sat in his automobile. I sat still, and soon the agents came along and started to question me, and then they took me away. John was sitting in his car when the agents brought me out, but when he saw I was pinched, he drove away. Suckers! And so the Chicago American wrote under banner headlines, "John Dillinger, the well-known woodcarver who has made Scarface Al Capone's career sound like that of a Boy Scout, walked out of a Chicago tavern that was being raided by agents of the United States Bureau of Investigation." The Chicago field office was fuming. J. Edgar Hoover was enraged. Melvin Purvis, who'd been in charge of the raid, scrambled to call Frechette's comments ridiculous. But yeah, Dillinger had vanished right from under their noses. Sure, what are you gonna do? The Bureau thought about retaliation, but they figured Pickett was such a lousy attorney that it would serve the government's interest to allow him to continue to represent Billie Frechette and John Dillinger. According to the United Press, as Billie was escorted to the airport, she taunted the federal agents and state police. "Watch out for John, he's the big bad wolf, you know." Meanwhile, Johnny conceded he could not free Billie and had to rely on Lou Pickett's skills to get her out. Indianapolis Star ran a front-page story that John Dillinger had recently spent the weekend in Mooresville surrounded by relatives and friends, and the law enforcement dumb butts never even knew. Superintendent for the Indiana State Police Al Feeney figured the whole town was aware of Johnny's presence but had said nothing and called the entire town antisocial. So the people of Mooresville protected their own and didn't care about everyone else's safety. He said, "The trouble is, they're all for Dillinger down there. It's unusual for a community to withhold such information for days and then let it reach the newspapers in such a way that it disparages the police. I simply can't understand it." Mooresvillians were mad. W.A. Lyon, head of the town board of trustees, said, "The town is humiliated by these charges that have been spread over the nation. If I weren't a churchman, I could cuss right now. Mooresville is a God-loving, law-abiding American town." A Mooresville bank clerk tried to explain it. "I wouldn't be afraid if John walked in here right now. He's a town boy, and I don't think he would hurt any of us. We don't even take precautions against him." So, we're forgetting that John Dillinger's crime spree started when he beat up a local grocer with a chain while brandishing a gun? All right. Indiana journalist Jack Sengner explained that the locals sided with the Dillinger family because they felt that the courts had dealt Johnny and his family a deep injustice. It was another painful example of how life was a lot harder for those with little money or influence. And let's take a moment to appreciate the irony that their town had produced a master bank robber just as their bank had foreclosed, taking $90,000 worth of the town folks' life savings with it. Johnny's trip to Mooresville once more increased his legend, and, unusual at the time, people who stood nothing to gain from him decided to protect him out of solidarity. The people were closing ranks. The Chicago Tribune said, "So great is the sympathy of Mooresville for its own Robin Hood that a petition is being circulated requesting Governor Paul V. McNutt to grant Dillinger amnesty if he surrenders." They argued there was precedent. In 1879, General Lew Wallace had extended a surrender amnesty agreement to William H. Bonney, aka Billy the Kid. The Kid accepted, but was double-crossed, and when he escaped from jail, he was shot by Sheriff Pat Garrett. In 1882, Frank James, brother of Jesse James, was pardoned by Missouri's governor and went on to become a productive, law-abiding citizen. Ultimately, those in the town were advocating for prison reform, and the general public started to agree. Even Governor McNutt's secretary, Wayne Coy, said, "There does not seem to me to be any escape from the fact that the state of Indiana made John Dillinger the public enemy that he is today. The Indiana Constitution provides that our penal code shall be reformative and not vindictive. Instead of reforming the prisoner, the penal institution provided him with an education in crime." Everyone realized Johnny would be caught and punished eventually, but for now they enjoyed the thrill of the chase to break the humdrum of Depression-era daily life. John Dillinger had become an actor who improvised the script as he went. If the feds wanted to take back control of the narrative, they needed a better script. On April 19, 1934, John Dillinger recalled all gang members from shore leave and organized a meeting right in Melvin Purvis's backyard at Lou Cernacki's Crystal Ballroom in Fox River Grove. They didn't know it, but Bessie Green, during her info dump a week earlier, had told the G-Men about the tavern being the favorite hangout for the Barker Karpus and Nelson Dillinger gangs. But even if Melvin Purvis had enough men, which he didn't, he could never hide an undercover operation in the town of 700, and Cernacki's connections with the local authority made his stakeout impossible. Well, they missed a whopper of a meeting. John Dillinger, Homer Van Meter, John Hamilton, Tommy Carroll, Babyface Nelson, plus all the moles minus Frechette. Nelson had invited Harry Sawyer's bartender, Pat Riley, along. Riley was a small-time crook who wanted to join the big league. He'd proven his worth by assisting Dillinger and Hamilton after their Mason City injuries. The gangsters' first point of order was the immense heat on the gang, or rather, the heat on John Dillinger. Nelson resented Johnny, whom he allowed in the gang out of the goodness of his own heart. But now, every headline in the paper was yelling about Dillinger Gang this and Dillinger Gang that. The gang was the Nelson Gang, but no one even mentioned him. His wife Helen downright hated Dillinger, whose mere presence threatened the lives of every gang member. Johnny had a few feelings about Jimmy as well. Babyface was unstable, unmanageable, ultra-violent, and kill-crazy. As Charrington later said, All knew Nelson as a vicious character and one who loved blood and had a great desire to kill anyone who got in his path. None of them desired Nelson's company, but it was often necessary to have him in on a job when they had one to perform. The gang decided that even corrupt St. Paul was too hot for them. They should find a more secluded spot to allow the heat to dissipate a bit. Sarnacki opened the Gangster Vacation Brochure, patent pending, and suggested a place called the Little Bohemia Lodge in the woods of northern Wisconsin. It was open all winter, but practically deserted, ideal for a bunch of super hot thugs. Dillinger suggested they leave early the following morning, and everyone agreed. They bunked on the second floor of Sarnacki's tavern. Sarnacki gave Nelson a white envelope with a letter of recommendation to give to the lodge's owner, Emil Wanatka, to ensure their welcome. Find out about what will become known as the Battle at Little Bohemia in the next episode. See you there.